Gucci Mane just dropped a brand new diss track called Crash Dummy, aimed directly at his own signee, 6ix9ine. The crazy part is that Gucci is basically admitting on the track that 6ix9ine set him up and robbed him. Gucci even raps about putting pen to paper under duress. Now, an FBI agent actually testified in court saying Gucci gave a full statement to the police about the entire situation. He is definitely not letting this slide. He dropped a video pulling up old receipts of Gucci swearing he would never talk to the cops. Then he literally threw stacks of cash at a picture of Gucci while screaming about double standards in the rap game.
For 5 straight years, he says the world refused to hear him. 5 years of being brushed aside, mocked, and written off. What exploded online wasn't some random outburst. It felt like a man unloading years of pressure, collecting on a debt he believed the culture had owed him all along. Very quickly, the tension turned personal. One name sat right in the middle of the storm: Gucci Mane. What 6ix9ine claims he uncovered in that material flipped the entire conversation on its head. One track lit the fuse, and once it spread, the internet erupted. April 10th, 2026 became one of those dates that seemed to swallow every platform at once. A live stream, a furious monologue, short clips flooding timelines everywhere. No matter where people looked, the same moment kept appearing again and again. At the center of it all was a figure the rap world had told to stay quiet for half a decade.
He claims the industry blackballed him for doing the exact same thing, but gives Gucci a free pass. The rules of the streets are clearly changing in real time, and the biggest hypocrites are finally getting fully exposed today.
Instead of disappearing, he stepped directly in front of the entire conversation and delivered a line designed to stop people cold. Now y'all believe me, that sentence carried weight, because Tekashi 6ix9ine has spent years trapped under a reputation the culture gave him and never removed. To many, he was permanently defined by one thing: the artist who cooperated, the one who testified, the one who sat in a federal courtroom and identified people while his co-defendants watched from across the room. From that point on, one label attached itself to him so tightly that it became almost impossible to separate the man from the accusation. Online, offline, in headlines, in comment sections, in casual debates, and in every mention of his name, that image followed him everywhere. It wasn't just criticism. It became the frame through which people viewed everything he did. Every move hit the same wall. No matter what he released, the conversation circled back. No matter what he said, the response was already waiting. It didn't matter whether he was making music, speaking publicly, or trying to reshape the story around his name. For a lot of people, the verdict had already been locked in place.
So once you've been in the feds, you get out, you understand the power of snitching. Because everybody snitches. Because that's why they got the conviction rate of 98%. Because everybody who goes to the feds, they really plead guilty or they tell. It's not no like fighting trial and people beating it. Because they don't even take the case unless they got all the evidence. They're not just taking cases.
Right. That is what made this moment feel so explosive. This wasn't only about anger, it was about timing. It was about years of resentment boiling over in public with millions of people watching in real time. The reaction wasn't built in a day, and the message wasn't aimed at strangers alone. It sounded like a challenge directed at an entire industry that in his eyes had judged him while protecting others. Once Gucci Mane's name entered the picture, the stakes changed instantly. Suddenly, this wasn't just another internet rant destined to burn bright and disappear. It became a direct confrontation. One tied to evidence, accusations, and a larger question about who gets condemned, who gets defended, and why those rules seem to shift depending on the person involved. That's why the clip spread so fast. People weren't just reacting to his tone, they were reacting to the possibility that he had found something powerful enough to force a second look at a story many believed had already been settled. The anger, the confidence, the timing, and the target all combined into a perfect storm. For years, 6ix9ine had been treated as if the case against him was closed forever. In that live stream, he acted like he had finally found the material to reopen it in front of everybody. Whether viewers agreed with him or not, the impact was immediate. The internet didn't simply notice, it stalled, stared, and picked sides. After 5 years of carrying the same stain, he appeared determined to turn the spotlight around. Instead of defending himself quietly, he chose the loudest possible stage. Instead of asking for sympathy, he delivered a confrontation. And with 4 words, he made sure nobody could ignore him anymore. No matter what he argued, how many tracks he put out, or how hard he pushed back, none of it seemed to matter. In the eyes of the culture, the verdict had already been handed down, and there was no sign that opinion was going to shift.
This is the weakest shit I've seen since... It would have been the weakest shit ever if it wasn't for J. Cole apologizing after he got dissed. Forget everything I said. Remember I said Gucci ain't gonna make a statement? Nigga, this is a statement right here. Yo, it's a statement right here.
Everything changed on the night of April 10th, 2026. That was when Gucci Mane, an artist who had spent more than 20 years building a reputation tied in part to a very public code of silence, released a song titled Crash Dummy. The moment it landed, the reaction was immediate. Online, the track didn't just get attention, it detonated. Once clips of 6ix9ine responding to the record started circulating, the situation escalated fast. What began as a song release turned into a full-blown internet firestorm. Short reaction clips flooded timelines almost instantly, and within hours they were everywhere. TikTok picked them up. Instagram Reels amplified them. YouTube reaction pages jumped in. Facebook followed right behind. Across April 10th and 11th, 2026, those snippets spread at lightning speed and pulled the hip-hop internet into one of its fiercest debates in years. At the center of that argument was something bigger than one artist or one diss track. People were suddenly arguing over street code, over snitching, and over the way those labels seemed to get enforced differently depending on who was involved. That tension is what made the moment impossible to ignore. It wasn't just music anymore. It had turned into a public trial playing out in real time across every major platform. Most shocking of all, the clip that caught fire was incredibly short, just 6 seconds. That was enough to dominate the conversation and become the sound of the week. Everybody had an opinion. Everybody picked a side. Every repost, reaction, and quote tweet added more fuel to the chaos. Still, to understand why those few seconds hit so hard, you have to look beyond the reaction itself. Before breaking down the full storm surrounding what 6ix9ine said on that stream, before going piece by piece through the evidence he brought up and the points he tried to make, there's an earlier chapter that matters just as much. The real story starts before the live stream clips, before the internet arguments, and even before the viral outrage. First, we have to understand what Crash Dummy actually was. Next, we need to look at why Gucci Mane made it in the first place. A song like that does not appear out of nowhere, especially not from someone whose image has long been connected to a specific kind of code. When an artist with that history releases a record carrying a title like Crash Dummy,
Tekashi started calling Gucci out, throwing around snitching claims and questioning his credibility.
Alright, so now y'all believe me? I've been literally saying this shit for 5 years. Let me break this shit down.
I won't do it. Won't snitch on nigga. If I gotta go, I'm gonna go. I done went before. I don't want to snitch on nigga to save my nobody's life. Not even my own. I die. That's on my mom.
Exhibit B, nigga.
Yeah, I ain't gonna tell nobody, not even the police. I don't believe in none of that shit. The only thing I believe in is don't tell the police.
people immediately start reading deeper into it. They want to know who it is about, what message it is sending, and whether it lines up with everything that artist has represented for years. After that, we can get into what happened once the record was out in the world, and why its impact hit so much harder than anyone expected. Because the truth is, the internet did not just react to a song, it reacted to what the song seemed to symbolize. It reacted to the contradictions, the accusations, and the uncomfortable questions that came rushing in behind it. That is why this moment blew up the way it did. That is why 6 seconds of reaction footage became impossible to escape. So before we dive into the complete mess that followed, we need to rewind. We need the full setup. We need the context behind the record, the reason it existed, and the chain of events that turned one release into a major flashpoint. Only then does the rest of this unfold the way it did. Long before January 10th, 2026, the groundwork had already been laid for a record like that to even exist. Gucci Mane is not just another rap name in the conversation. He is widely seen as one of the key figures who helped shape trap music into what it became. As the force behind 1017 Records, he built far more than a label. he created a platform that introduced artists, strengthened careers, and helped define Southern hip-hop over the past decade and a half. Calling Gucci Mane an institution is not exaggeration. It is simply the clearest way to describe the weight he carries in the culture. His influence reaches beyond music releases and headlines. It is tied to a larger identity, a legacy, and a reputation that has followed him for years. That is why the clip hit so hard. The footage was old, but the message landed like brand new evidence being presented in open court. It was Gucci Mane speaking for himself with no need for interpretation, no rumor, no second-hand version, just his own words, clearly laying out what he believed and how he claimed he moved.
Ratting is no loyalty, right?
Yeah.
So if I'm a girl, is that loyalty?
Not at all.
It's the truth. So people gonna be, yo, cut to the next shit. Yo, skip this shit. He's spitting too much facts. Skip it, skip it, skip it. I don't want to hear it.
But wait, I gotta ask though, but what's worse though? Banging your homie's girl or putting your homie behind bars?
If I kidnap you, am I your homie?
Hell no.
What made the moment even sharper was how direct it was. The camera captured him making a firm promise that he would not cooperate under any circumstances, not with anyone, not with authorities. According to him, that was the code. That was the principle he stood on. More importantly, it was a standard he had repeated publicly, loudly, and over a long stretch of time. So when that old footage resurfaced, it was impossible to separate the past statement from the present situation. That is where 6ix9ine's short response carried so much weight. Just 5 words, yet it cut straight to the contradiction people were already circling. The reaction did not need a long explanation. The footage had already done most of the work. Once those old statements were brought back into view, the gap between what was once said and what had happened later became the entire story. Everything turned on what unfolded between that earlier version of Gucci Mane in April 2026. A studio robbery in Dallas changed the temperature. After that came a federal indictment listing 9 names. Then the diss track arrived, adding even more fuel to a situation that was already impossible to ignore. Each development stacked on top of the last, turning a tense situation into something much bigger. What had once been a matter of personal image and public code suddenly became part of a far more explosive narrative. Viewed in that sequence, the controversy was not just about a song. It was about reputation, memory, and the danger of having your own words brought back at the exact moment they become hardest to defend. For someone with Gucci Mane's stature, that kind of footage does not just resurface. It reopens everything. Fans remember, critics take notes. Rivals do not miss opportunities like that. By the time the clip was circulating again, the discussion had moved beyond music itself. People were no longer only talking about records, bars, or diss tracks. They were talking about consistency. They were measuring public statements against later events. They were asking whether the image that had been built over years could survive that kind of scrutiny. And that is why the moment felt so charged. It was not only the video. It was not only 6ix9ine's reaction. It was the collision between an old declaration and a new reality.
Listen, I'm gonna break this shit down. Little 6ix9ine situation? Y'all remember the 6ix9ine situation? When y'all say, just hit in the streets, you know what you signed up for? You know what you signed up for? Nigga, they pulled up on
Whoa.
Once that happened, the conversation changed completely. What had once been archived footage became central evidence in a much larger debate. And from there, the story only grew louder. Online reaction was immediate. People across the internet pointed to the situation as one of the clearest, most public displays of hypocrisy the rap world had seen in years. Now move to January 10, 2026. In Dallas, Texas, a meeting was scheduled inside a music studio. On paper, it looked routine. Gucci Mane was supposed to sit down with one of his artists connected to his team at 1017 Records, Pooh Shiesty, whose legal name is Lontrell Williams Jr. By that point, Pooh Shiesty was already well known for having served federal time in an earlier gun case. After returning home, he went right back to making music and quickly reminded listeners why his name still carried weight. His release sparked the kind of comeback story hip-hop often embraces. He was active again, recording again, and appearing to pick up exactly where he had left off. Behind the scenes, though, there was reportedly a serious problem. Pooh Shiesty wanted out of his deal with Gucci Mane's label. According to federal prosecutors, the path chosen to force that separation was not handled through business channels. There was no formal negotiation, no legal dispute quietly worked through attorneys, and no calm sit-down to resolve the issue. Instead, prosecutors say the situation escalated into something far more serious. Their allegation is that the studio meeting in Dallas was never just a meeting at all. Federal authorities claim Pooh Shiesty, his father, fellow rapper Big 30, and 6 other people arrived at what Gucci believed was a legitimate business discussion and turned the entire setup into an armed robbery. That accusation alone was enough to send shockwaves through social media because the contrast was impossible to ignore.
Gucci walked in the damn studio. The footage is going to show Pooh Shiesty had one on him, Big 30 had one on him. Only person who really going to escape from this is the Pops. The Pops did not want none of this to go on. Gucci looked at the dad like the Pops just head down. You can't tell your son nothing right now. Your son is the #1 right now.
Here was an artist publicly framed as being in the middle of a triumphant return, while prosecutors were describing a scene that painted a completely different picture. According to the government's account, once the victims were inside the studio, the atmosphere changed instantly. What should have been a standard industry conversation allegedly became a trap. That is where this story takes a dramatic turn. Federal prosecutors say the group did not approach the dispute like a contract disagreement. In their telling, this was not about paperwork or business pressure applied through normal industry tactics. They describe it as a coordinated move involving intimidation and force. The reason the case grabbed so much attention so quickly is because of what it seemed to represent. The music business often celebrates loyalty, success after setbacks, and artists rebuilding their careers. This situation, at least as prosecutors described it, appeared to collide directly with that image. A comeback narrative was suddenly sharing space with allegations of a studio ambush. That disconnect is what fueled so much public discussion. For many observers, it was not just the names involved that made the story explosive, it was the setting. A music studio is supposed to be a place for collaboration, recording, planning, and business. In this case, prosecutors say that familiar environment became the backdrop for something much more alarming. The allegations are especially striking because they involve people who were not strangers to one another. This was not being presented as a random incident between unrelated parties. Authorities framed it as a dispute tied to an artist-label relationship, which made the accusations even more sensational. At the center of it all was one core issue. Pooh Shiesty wanted out. What followed, according to federal prosecutors, was not an ordinary effort to end a contract. They alleged that the meeting was used as the opening move in a planned robbery, carried out by Shiesty, his father, Big 30, and 6 others, after Gucci Mane had been led to believe he was walking into a normal business discussion. And once everyone was inside, prosecutors alleged that Shiesty produced.
According to prosecutors, a firearm was used to intimidate a victim into signing paperwork that would free Pooh Shiesty from a label agreement. Investigators say the pressure did not stop there. Jewelry, expensive watches, and cash were also allegedly taken during the incident. Authorities further claim one person was grabbed by the neck while the exit was blocked, so nobody inside could leave until the paperwork was completed. In other words, this was described as a controlled and frightening situation, not a simple contract dispute that got out of hand. What makes the case even more serious is the amount of evidence federal investigators say they gathered. Their file reportedly includes studio surveillance footage, phone data, and location information from an ankle monitor.
Pooh Shiesty about to get life in federal prison because he robbed and kidnapped Gucci Mane, and Gucci said he did it. According to the paperwork, Shiesty, his dad, and Memphis rapper Big 30 had Gucci pinned in a corner inside of a recording booth. Shiesty upped Draco, and they made him sign a release letting him go from the 1017 label before robbing Gucci of his earrings, jewelry, his wedding ring, and cash.
At the time, Pooh Shiesty was already on home confinement tied to an earlier federal gun case, which prosecutors say helped them track his movements. The complaint also points to fingerprints, along with social media posts in which members of the group allegedly appeared to display items believed to have been taken afterward. Taken together, officials presented this as far more than gossip or online speculation. This was laid out in a federal criminal complaint backed by both physical evidence and digital records. Then came the arrests. On April 1, 2026, Pooh Shiesty, his father Big 30, and 6 other people were arrested on federal kidnapping and conspiracy charges. Federal authorities said 8 of the 9 defendants were taken into custody across 3 major cities, Dallas, Memphis, and Nashville. That alone turned the case into a major national story. It is not every day that federal prosecutors step in and announce kidnapping charges involving multiple recording artists at the same time. The scope of the operation immediately signaled how seriously authorities were treating the allegations.
During a press conference, the United States Attorney publicly confirmed the sweep and emphasized the wide reach of the arrests. Officials said 8 of the 9 had been picked up the day before in coordinated action spanning Dallas, Memphis, and Nashville. That kind of multi-state effort suggested investigators had been building this case carefully and were ready to move all at once. Among those named by authorities was Lontrell Williams Jr., better known to the public as Pooh Shiesty. His inclusion in the announcement placed him at the center of one of the most explosive federal cases connected to the music world in recent memory. What began as allegations surrounding a label dispute had now escalated into a full-scale federal prosecution with serious charges, multiple defendants, and a mountain of evidence that investigators say tells a very clear story.
But it gets better. Shiesty had 6 of his goons with him. They robbed Gucci's cameraman and another man, and then posted all the shit that they took on social media. Now, Roderick Davis, a.k.a. Gucci, would identify Pooh Shiesty was wearing a Shiesty during the robbery. He'd also identify Big.
Bond requests were rejected from multiple co-defendants. During that period, Pooh Shiesty stayed in federal custody in Dallas. At the same time, Gucci Mane's name appeared in court filings as someone who had identified Shiesty, but Gucci publicly pushed back on that narrative. He said he was not working with investigators and had no plans to take the stand. An FBI agent reportedly even stated they had not received information from him directly. Still, what happened next turned the story into something much bigger. Only 9 days after the arrests, Gucci Mane stepped into the booth and recorded a new track. The song was Crash Dummy, created with production from Zaytoven, his longtime collaborator and one of the defining names behind Atlanta's most recognizable rap sound. That alone caught attention. Yet it was the content of the record that really sent people into a frenzy.
From the opening lines to the closing moments, the message felt impossible to miss. The song pointed straight at the incident in that Dallas studio. Gucci never directly said Pooh Shiesty's name, but listeners did not need much help connecting the dots. He painted a picture of going into what he believed was a legitimate business meeting, only to realize the situation had turned against him. He framed it as a moment where trust had been exploited and goodwill had been taken advantage of. More than anything, he used one phrase that instantly stuck: crash dummies. With that label, he portrayed the people involved as reckless figures making disastrous decisions without fully thinking through the consequences. It was sharp, calculated, and impossible to ignore. One lyric especially took over the conversation online. In that line, Gucci referenced the allegation that the person accused of robbing him was technically still signed to his label. His reasoning was blunt. Paperwork obtained through threats does not amount to a valid release. That statement became one of the most replayed and discussed parts of the song because it seemed to turn a private legal mess into a very public declaration. Naturally, the reaction was immediate. Social media lit up almost as soon as the track surfaced. Some people argued Gucci was simply telling his side through music, doing what artists have always done when real life spills into the booth. Others saw it very differently, questioning whether dropping such a pointed record so soon after the arrest would only intensify scrutiny around an already explosive case. Every line was dissected. Every reference was pulled apart. Fans, bloggers, and commentators all tried to figure out how much of the song was emotion, how much was strategy, and how much was a warning shot.
Gucci supporters insisted there was a major difference between making music about your own experience and cooperating with law enforcement. In their view, a song is a song, not a courtroom statement. They argued that expressing anger, betrayal, or disbelief on a record should not automatically be interpreted as helping a case. That distinction became the center of the debate. Critics, however, were not convinced so easily. To them, the timing was just too striking to ignore. 9 days after the arrests, with court documents already circulating and rumors growing by the hour, Gucci released a track that many believed directly reflected the same situation. Whether intended or not, it poured fuel on an already raging conversation. That is what made Crash Dummies so explosive. It was not just another diss record or a vague industry jab. It landed in the middle of an active controversy, carried the weight of real allegations, and arrived at a moment when the public was desperate for any clue about what had really happened. Even without naming names, the message felt loud, and once the internet grabbed hold of it, there was no slowing the fallout. He insisted he had never worked with investigators. In his view, choosing not to appear in court and choosing not to speak under oath made all the difference. From that perspective, putting his experience into a song was simply art, not cooperation with prosecutors. A lot of people saw it very differently. To his critics, releasing music that openly describes events tied to an ongoing federal case, especially while the accused are still waiting for trial, crosses a line. They argue that even without stepping into a courtroom, publicly telling that story could still help build pressure around the case. Within hip-hop circles, that accusation quickly took on a familiar label: dry snitching.
Pooh Shiesty just found out Gucci Mane's bitch identified him and helped the police in his arrest, and I can't lie, his reaction made me feel bad for him. See, yesterday, Pooh went to court for his bond hearing, and like expected, they denied him bond. At that court hearing, there was an FBI agent who confirmed that Gucci did give a
Few people on earth were more perfectly placed to amplify that idea than one particular figure in the music world. He was at home, watching all of it play out in real time. Before long, he went live. That moment set the stage for something people in hip-hop would not stop talking about. We picked the story back up on the night of April 10th, 2026. The setting is a live stream that instantly felt massive, chaotic, and historically important. The kind of internet moment that pulls in viewers whether they admit it or not. It was hosted by Adin Ross, with N3 also there. And the featured guest was Daniel Hernandez, better known in the culture as Tekashi 6ix9ine. By that point, Tekashi had already become one of those figures people claimed they were done paying attention to. Yet somehow, they kept watching anyway. No matter how many times audiences said they had moved on, his name still had a way of dragging everyone back into the conversation. That alone made the stream feel combustible before it even truly began. What happened that night carried extra weight because it was not just another celebrity appearance online. This was a collision of old accusations, public perception, internet spectacle, and rap politics all meeting in one place. The history attached to Tekashi meant that every word was going to be dissected, clipped, reposted, and debated from every possible angle. Nothing about it felt casual. The tension came from more than just his presence. It came from the timing. It came from what had already been said. It came from the larger question hanging over the entire situation. When does public storytelling stop being self-expression and start looking like something else? That debate had already been simmering, but this stream gave it a stage big enough for the whole culture to watch.
Adin Ross brought the platform. N3 added to the energy in the room. Tekashi brought the history, the controversy, and the kind of attention that turns a regular stream into an event. Put those pieces together, and the result was unavoidable. People tuned in out of curiosity, disbelief, criticism, entertainment, or all four at once. Even those who insisted they were above it still wanted to know what was said. That is what made the broadcast feel so important. It was not only about a guest appearance, it was about who was speaking, what had happened before, and what the culture was prepared to do with those words afterward. Every reaction was already loaded before the conversation even got moving. To really understand why that stream landed with such force, you have to understand the baggage surrounding Tekashi 6ix9ine, the way his name had become tied to arguments about loyalty, credibility, and public cooperation. Once that context enters the picture, the night of April 10th stops looking like a random internet moment and starts looking like something much bigger. It becomes a flashpoint, a test case, a spectacle with consequences. And once the stream started, there was no looking away. Picture the full 5-year timeline all at once. Back in 2018, 6ix9ine was only 22. He had a massive hit dominating the air, an image nobody could overlook, and a federal RICO case hanging over him that threatened to erase nearly all of his prime working years if he decided to take it to trial. Faced with that reality, he chose a different route. He worked with federal prosecutors. In the case involving the 9 Trey gangster bloods, he took the stand against the people charged alongside him. He identified individuals, provided specific information, and, as a result, left federal custody far sooner than the punishment he had originally been staring down. What followed was immediate and brutal in a cultural sense. Few artists in recent memory have faced that level of widespread rejection for such a long stretch of time. Doors started closing fast. Collaborations disappeared. Venues and promoters kept their distance. Industry spaces that might have welcomed controversy suddenly had no interest in hearing him out. Whenever he tried to insert himself into larger conversations about music, loyalty, or the business itself, he was often shut down before he could even make a point. Over time, his name stopped being just the name of an artist. It turned into a symbol. He became the standard people used when they wanted to measure so-called street credibility. Mentioning him was enough to end arguments, start debates, or make a joke. His story was used as a warning, an example of what not to do, and for many, a permanent stain that could never be removed. Yet through all of it, one question kept surfacing again and again from 6ix9ine. The same challenge lingered for years, refusing to go away. If this is how the culture reacts when one artist breaks the code, what happens when someone else ends up in that exact same position? More specifically, what happens when the very artists who speak the loudest about loyalty, silence, and rules are suddenly forced to make the kind of decision they always judged from a safe distance? That is where the real tension begins. Because it is easy to defend a code when the consequences are theoretical. It sounds strong in songs. It sounds powerful in interviews. It sounds unquestionable when there is no case number attached to your name, no courtroom ahead of you, and no possibility that one decision could change the course of your entire life.
Tekashi started calling Gucci out, throwing around snitching claims and questioning his credibility.
Alright, so now y'all believe me? I've been literally saying this shit for 5 years. Let me break this shit down.
I won't do that. Won't snitch on niggas. If I gotta go, I'm gonna go. I done wait before. I always snitch on nigga the same amount. Nobody life. Not even my own. I die. That's on my mom.
Exhibit B, nigga.
Yeah, I ain't gonna tell nobody, not even the police. I don't believe in none of that shit. The only thing I believe in is don't tell the police.
Principles are simple when they cost nothing. They become far more complicated when freedom, family, money, and the future all get pulled into the same equation. That is what made 6ix9ine's situation so explosive. It was never just about one artist making one choice. It became a cultural stress test. His case forced people to reveal whether their standards were truly universal or only rigid when applied to someone they already disliked. Once his name became shorthand for betrayal, the bigger issue moved into the background. The uncomfortable question was no longer just what he did. The deeper question was whether the same outrage would exist if the roles were reversed, and a more respected figure found themselves under the same pressure. For 5 years, that idea kept hovering over the conversation. Not as a defense, not as an excuse, more like a challenge to the consistency of the people doing the judging. If the code is really the code, then it should apply the same way every time. No matter who the artist is, how famous they are, or how much goodwill they built before everything fell apart. And if it does not, then maybe this was never only about the rules. Maybe it was also about who the culture decided was worth condemning forever. What happens when influence and status are no longer enough to shield someone? What does it look like when federal attention lands on a figure who actually carries real weight in the culture? During that stream, 6ix9ine took that exact question and flipped it back on everyone who had repeated it for years. He did it carefully, but with intensity. Every point felt deliberate, like this was a case he had been building in private for a very long time. There was anger in it, no doubt, yet it was focused anger, not random, not sloppy, structured. Instead of speaking in broad claims, he started assembling receipts. He pulled up older footage of Gucci preaching the code, replayed those moments, and placed them side by side with everything that had unfolded since April 1st, 2026. That comparison became the engine of the entire stream. It was not just about what had been said before, it was about whether those statements still held up once the pressure became real. From there, the conversation got even more uncomfortable. At one point, 6ix9ine addressed race directly. He did not hint at it or dance around it. He said clearly that Gucci was being given more patience, more understanding, and more room to recover than he himself had ever been given, and that race was the reason. In his view, the culture was not applying one universal standard. According to him, the reaction changes depending on who the person is and how they are perceived. That is the kind of claim that instantly changes the temperature of a conversation. There is no easy answer to an accusation like that. It is emotionally charged, deeply sensitive, and guaranteed to divide people the moment it is said out loud. The second he framed it that way, the debate stopped being just about loyalty, codes, and public image. Suddenly, another argument was running at the same time across every comment section, every repost, and every reaction clip. People were no longer discussing only what Gucci did or did not say. They were now fighting over whether the public response itself was uneven from the beginning. That is where the stream became bigger than a personal grievance. Up to that point, some viewers may have expected a heated vent-session, a dramatic airing of frustration, or a blunt call-out aimed at one person. Instead, 6ix9ine pushed the discussion into a more layered place. He turned it into a challenge aimed at the audience, the media voices around the story, and the culture that had helped shape both men's reputations in the first place.
Then came the shift that caught a lot of people off guard. The stream stopped feeling purely emotional and started becoming technical. That change mattered because one of the strongest parts of 6ix9ine's rant was not the pain behind it, and it was not even the broader cultural criticism, as explosive as that was. What made that section hit differently was that he moved into specifics. He began speaking in a way that, depending on your own background and what you know about these situations, may have sounded more grounded and more convincing than anything else he had said up to that point. For some viewers, that was the moment the stream became harder to dismiss. Emotion can be waved away. Personal resentment can be explained off as bitterness. Cultural arguments can be labeled messy or divisive. Technical detail is different. Once a speaker starts laying out process, sequence, and structure, the audience has something more concrete to examine. The conversation is no longer just about tone. It becomes about substance. That is why this section stood out. It suggested that 6ix9ine was not relying only on outrage to carry his case. He was trying to build credibility through detail.
Oh, this your wedding ring, nigga? Let me get that. If they pulled up on street shit, now you a businessman? How many excuses?
Whether people agreed with him or not, the method changed the way the stream landed. It gave his argument a different kind of weight, and it forced listeners to pay closer attention to what exactly he was claiming, how he was connecting the timeline, and why he believed the public response had been so uneven in the first place. Here's the reality of how a federal case really works. The system isn't emotional, and it doesn't pause for anyone. By the system, he was talking about the Department of Justice, the full force of the United States government, listed in black and white as the plaintiff against one person whose name appears on the other side of the case. That point carried weight because he wasn't speaking in the abstract. He was describing something he had personally experienced. Sitting inside a federal courtroom, staring at a charging document that read United States of America versus Daniel Hernandez, he understood in a direct and unforgettable way what that truly represents. It means one individual standing opposite an institution with enormous reach, deep resources, and overwhelming authority. From there, he laid out the distinction between state charges and federal charges with striking precision. Legal observers noted that his explanation was, in substance, essentially right. State cases and federal cases may sound similar to the public, but they do not operate the same way. Once the federal government is involved, the scale changes, the pressure changes, the consequences can change too. He also broke down what it means when a grand jury subpoena comes from federal court. That document is not just paperwork. It is a formal signal that the machinery of federal prosecution is moving. And once it starts, it does not concern itself with personal codes, public image, or the rules people may follow outside the courtroom. One of the sharpest parts of his argument was the reminder that street loyalty has no legal standing. There is no constitutional amendment for that. No clause in the law shields someone from the consequences of refusing to comply with a federal judge's order to testify. If the court commands testimony and that order is ignored, contempt charges are a real possibility. The federal system does not make exceptions because someone believes they are following a different set of rules.
That was the foundation he was building toward. He was not trying to frame Gucci as morally flawed, nor was he arguing that Gucci was personally a bad person. His point was much bigger than any one man's character. It was about structure. It was about power. It was about the reality that the federal government operates like a machine, and that machine is indifferent to reputation, indifferent to image,
and indifferent to whatever code someone believes they live by. In his view, that is the part many people fail to grasp. Outside the courtroom, status can matter. A name can carry influence. A reputation can shape how others respond. Federal prosecution strips all of that away. Once the case begins, those outside identities lose their force against the formal power of the government. That is why his explanation landed so hard. It wasn't emotional posturing. It wasn't even really an attack. It was a cold description of how federal authority functions when it turns its attention toward one person. No matter how respected someone may be in their world, the federal process is not built to recognize those informal codes. At the center of his argument was a simple but unsettling truth. The government does not need to care what someone's personal principles are. It only cares about what the law demands, what the court orders, and whether those orders are followed. Everything else becomes secondary the moment that federal case number is assigned and the name at the top reads United States of America. 2 decades in music, and the stream still managed to end in a way almost nobody saw coming. After hours of receipts, documents, legal commentary, cultural debate, and complaints about money, 6ix9ine did something that instantly changed the tone. He lifted a sheet of paper and read a verse from the Bible. For some people, that landed as a powerful final statement. For others, it felt completely unbelievable. Honestly, your reaction to that moment probably says everything about how you view the entire situation leading up to it. Either way, once those clips were cut up, posted, shared, screen recorded, reposted, and spread across every major platform, there was no putting the story back in the box. The fallout had already started. The message was out. What had been building for hours suddenly turned into something much bigger. And now it was heading straight for the center of the rap world. At that point, silence was no longer an option. Everybody had something to say. The problem was, nobody could agree on anything. By the morning of April 11th, 2026, those stream clips were moving at the kind of speed hip-hop internet culture only sees a few times a year. This was no longer just a conversation for dedicated rap fans who follow every name, every rumor, and every live stream in real time. The story had broken out of its lane. Now, it was reaching people far outside that circle. It was your uncle who barely knows current rap at all. It was your coworker asking questions with total confidence while clearly having no idea what they were talking about. It was the friend who never pays attention to hip-hop suddenly texting you a clip and asking, "What is this?" That is when you know the algorithm has fully taken over.
Let's just say Pooh is coming home sooner than we think. The other day, Pooh Shiesty's lawyer would do a press on the whole case, and he's claiming the feds don't have any sophisticated evidence. They just clout chase. They were relying on Gucci's statement, but after he confirmed he wasn't testifying, then that makes their case weak. Y'all think Pooh beating this?
Once a story hits that level, it stops belonging to one fan base. It turns into a full-scale internet event. The original context starts getting stripped away. People jump in halfway through. Others react to reactions. Some are discussing the facts. Some are responding to headlines. And plenty are just choosing sides based on whichever version reached them first. That is exactly what happened here.
The Bible verse at the end gave the whole stream one final image people could not stop talking about. Not the paperwork, not the exhibits, not even the long legal and financial arguments that came before it. That closing moment became the clip. It became the symbol. It became the thing everyone used to summarize hours of chaos in less than a minute. Naturally, that only made the reactions louder. Some voices treated it like a calculated move, a dramatic ending designed to make the entire stream impossible to ignore. Others saw it as sincere. A few dismissed the whole thing outright. Plenty of people were not even debating what was said anymore. They were debating what it meant. And in internet culture, that is usually when a story becomes impossible to control. By then, the blast radius was expanding fast. Every repost brought in a new audience. Every screenshot created another round of arguments. Each clipped reaction fed the next one. Before long, the rap world was not just responding to the stream itself, it was responding to everyone else responding to it. That is where things really shifted. Because once the wider rap conversation got involved, the discussion stopped being about one stream ending strangely. It became a referendum on everything around it. Credibility, motive, loyalty, money, image, and who had the right to frame the story in the first place. No shared conclusion ever formed. No clean consensus arrived to settle things down. Instead, what took over was pure division.
One side thought the moment said everything. Another side thought it said nothing at all. Some people focused on the evidence. Others focused on the performance. A lot of people picked the part that best matched what they already believed and ran with it. And that is why the reaction hit so hard. Because by the time the internet finished clipping, captioning, and circulating that final moment, the discussion had outgrown the original stream completely. What started as one person talking had turned into the entire rap world talking over itself at the exact same time. Those snippets were ripped apart, reposted, and blasted into every timeline imaginable. No matter where you looked, the same clips were waiting, looping across platforms, feeding the frenzy, and pulling more people into the conversation by the minute. Beneath all that noise, though, sat one uncomfortable question nobody seemed able to answer cleanly. Once a moment like that hits the culture, certainty disappears fast. In its place comes a flood of reactions, hot takes, theories, and jokes from every possible angle. Everybody has something to say, yet almost nobody agrees on what they're actually looking at. That uncertainty is exactly what turned the situation into such a spectacle. The first person to cut through the mess with a response that felt sharp, memorable, and instantly repeatable was Freddie Gibbs. He didn't waste time. Just hours after Crash Dummy surfaced, Gibbs jumped onto Instagram stories and delivered a reaction with the kind of concise precision that has long been part of his appeal. He said what a lot of people were thinking, but in a way, only he could. According to Gibbs, the whole thing had to be artificial intelligence. In his view, the idea that someone with Gucci Mane's reputation and status would put out a record that seemed to narrate a federal crime while doing it over production from the producer most closely tied to his legacy was simply too ridiculous to accept as reality. It sounded less like a believable release and more like something generated by the internet's wildest imagination. That first post landed immediately. People didn't just react to it, they adopted it. The phrasing was so clean and so direct that it spread almost instantly, turning into one of those rare online lines that escapes its original context and starts living a life of its own. Within hours, it felt less like a celebrity reaction and more like internet furniture, fixed in place and impossible to ignore. Gibbs followed it up with another post and somehow managed to make the moment even sharper. The wording was so blunt, so perfectly timed that it crossed over from commentary into meme status almost on contact. Before the day had even finished unfolding, one line had already become the summary people kept returning to. A man had snitched on a Zaytoven beat. That phrase hit because it captured the absurdity of the entire situation in a way long explanations never could. It was funny, cutting, and unforgettable all at once. More importantly, it distilled a complicated cultural reaction into a single sentence people could quote, repost, and build jokes around without needing any extra context. In a chaotic moment, Gibbs had handed the internet its slogan. Part of what made it resonate so hard was the contrast packed into it. Zaytoven's sound carries a certain history and weight, especially when tied to Gucci Mane. So pairing that kind of musical backdrop with something people viewed as self-incriminating felt surreal to many listeners. The disconnect was so extreme that it almost demanded a response, and Gibbs gave the internet the version that stuck. From there, the reaction snowballed. Once that framing took hold, the discourse shifted. It was no longer just about the track itself. Now it was about how unbelievable the whole thing felt, how strange the optics were, and how quickly one perfectly worded observation could define the public mood. In a chaotic moment, Gibbs had handed the internet its slogan. That is why his response mattered so much. He didn't just comment on the situation, he named it. Once the internet has a name for something, the story changes fast. What made this moment even more striking was the unlikely overlap between voices that almost never line up. On nearly every issue, they tend to clash. Yet here, they landed in roughly the same place, and that alone became part of the drama. DJ Academics approached the situation from his own lane, but his conclusion echoed the broader point. He framed it in the sharpest way possible, turning the conversation into a direct challenge about fairness inside hip-hop. During a stream, he argued that the culture actually owed Tekashi 6ix9ine a real apology. His case was blunt and hard to miss. Back in 2018, 6ix9ine cooperated with federal authorities, and the reaction from hip-hop was immediate. There was no grace period, no careful distinction, and no real public effort to weigh context. The judgment hit fast, and from that point forward, the damage to his standing in the culture was treated as permanent. Now compare that with what happened in 2026. Gucci Mane released a song that openly described details tied to an active federal kidnapping case involving one of his own artists. Instead of being met with an instant cultural verdict, the response played out very differently. For days, people debated it from every angle. Commentary flooded in. Some offered caveats, others pushed alternative interpretations, and many tried to slow the rush to judgment by adding layers of nuance. That contrast is what academics zeroed in on. To him, the issue was not whether the two situations were identical in every detail. The bigger question was why the standard appeared so strict in one case and so flexible in the other.
He pushed the argument further by bringing up something he felt had been overlooked for years. In 6ix9ine's case, there was documented video evidence connected to his own kidnapping. According to academics, that mattered because it showed he had been taken and robbed before he ever made the decision to cooperate. In his view, that part of the timeline was consistently brushed aside whenever people in the culture decided how to label him. From there, his argument became even more pointed. If context is supposed to matter now, he suggested, then it should have mattered then too. If the culture is willing to slow down, analyze details, and hear out competing perspectives in one high-profile situation, he questioned why that same patience was not extended in the other. That, for him, was the heart of the double standard claim. Academics said the selective use of these rules simply could not be defended in any consistent way, not emotionally, not culturally, and certainly not intellectually. His point was that the principles seemed to shift depending on who was involved, and once people noticed that, it became much harder to argue that the culture was applying one fixed code across the board. The debate did not stop with his monologue. He went back and forth at length with Wack 100, who challenged the framing and took a different position on Gucci Mane's situation. That exchange only added more fuel to an argument that was already spreading fast, because it forced people to confront a bigger issue than either individual case. At that point, the discussion was no longer just about one rapper, one song, or one decision. It had turned into a wider referendum on how hip-hop hands out judgment, who gets immediate condemnation, and who receives the benefit of explanation. Once that question was out in the open, it became impossible to ignore. This case, as some people saw it, was never a simple comparison. The key difference was timing. Authorities already had the core proof before the music ever entered the picture. The incident had been captured on surveillance. Phone logs were already there. Data from the ankle monitor had already been collected and was sitting with the government. From that perspective, the track did not hand prosecutors anything they did not already possess. Wack 100 leaned heavily on that point. In his view, there is a major gap between recording a song about something that happened to you and personally stepping forward to help build a legal case. One, he suggested, is creative expression shaped by pain, fear, and aftermath. The other is direct participation with investigators. To him, those are not remotely the same act, and treating them as identical misses a critical distinction. That argument landed because it pushed the conversation into much deeper territory.
What down? Nigga, I hate to see you up. Tell the truth, you went out like a real crash diamond. And after all that, boy, you still signed to me? Wow. I'm like Birdman and nigga, this my cash.
Suddenly, this was no longer just about one artist, one song, or one case. It became a bigger question about where people draw the line. If someone publicly tells their side of a story while a federal case is still active, does that count as cooperation in any real sense? Or is it simply a person turning a traumatic event into art, especially when the authorities already had the evidence long before the lyrics existed? There is no easy conclusion, and that uncertainty is exactly why the debate stayed alive. Legally, morally, and culturally, people came to very different answers. Some heard the song and believed it crossed a line, even without formal testimony. Others felt that public storytelling, especially in music, should not automatically be treated like assisting prosecutors. The more people argued about it, the clearer it became that this was one of the rare moments where the issue was actually bigger than the personalities involved.
Part of what made the discussion so compelling was that both sides seemed to be touching on something real. On one hand, direct cooperation with law enforcement carries a very specific meaning. On the other, Putting details of an open federal matter into a public song can feel, to some listeners, like something that goes beyond personal reflection. That gray area is where the entire controversy lived. No clean rules settled it. No single definition ended it. The lack of a firm answer kept the subject moving from conversation to conversation. Waka Flocka Flame added another layer, and his comments shifted attention in a way that had not really been explored before. Instead of staying locked in the usual arguments, he brought up a personal memory from the period when he was working with Gucci. He spoke about being introduced to someone on Gucci's security team. On the surface, that might sound like a small detail. In reality, it changed the frame. Why? Because that kind of first-hand recollection does more than fill in background. It places people in a real-world environment with real security concerns, real relationships, and real decisions being made behind the scenes. Once that detail started circulating, the conversation was no longer just about lyrics, law, and public perception. It also opened the door to a less discussed angle, the actual structure around the artist at that time, and what that might suggest about how events were being handled. That shift mattered. Up to that point, most of the attention had centered on whether the music itself should be seen as harmful, revealing, or unfairly judged. Waka's comment nudged the audience toward a different question entirely. It suggested there may have been more to understand about the environment surrounding Gucci than people had previously considered. Even without making a sweeping claim, the observation brought fresh tension to an already complicated story.
Once that happened, the conversation became even harder to simplify. What first looked like a straightforward accusation or defense kept unfolding into something more layered, more personal, and much more difficult to neatly define. That's the moment the entire discussion took a sharp turn. Up to that point, people could still argue the usual angles, question motives, and frame the story through the lens of rap politics. Once this detail entered the picture, though, the energy shifted completely. Waka brought up something far more serious than opinion or image. A retired police officer was allegedly working security for Gucci Mane and was present as part of his normal protection team. That distinction mattered. Waka's argument wasn't casual, and it wasn't just gossip. He was making a precise point about how different worlds operate under different rules. In street culture, people often debate loyalty, silence, and what someone is supposed to say or not say after a major incident. Law enforcement does not function by those same expectations. Someone with a policing background, whether currently serving, retired, or working off-duty, follows a separate standard altogether. Those obligations do not disappear because the person is now wearing a security jacket instead of a badge. A former officer who witnesses a serious crime is not simply another member of an entourage. That person is tied to a different system, one built around reporting, documentation, and cooperation with official processes. An employer cannot just tell them to overlook what happened. Personal loyalty does not erase professional responsibility, especially when the incident in question is this severe. That was the heart of Waka's point.
He was not saying Gucci Mane personally crossed some line in a way people loosely accuse public figures of doing. He was drawing attention to the structure of the situation itself. If someone with law enforcement training and obligations is standing right there during a major criminal event, the whole case enters a different lane almost immediately. From there, everything changes. Federal investigators do not look at that kind of setup the same way they would view an incident involving only civilians with no institutional ties. The presence of even one individual connected to law enforcement on the victim side can affect what information authorities are able to reach, what they can demand, and how fast they can organize the facts into a prosecutable case. In a federal kidnapping investigation, that is not a minor technicality. It can become one of the most important details in the entire timeline. That is why the temperature of the conversation rose so quickly. Instead of arguing only about reputation, loyalty, or how the culture might interpret Gucci Mane's position, the focus moved to something more concrete and far less negotiable. Waka was highlighting that there are forces bigger than public opinion at work here. Street expectations may be debated endlessly, but legal systems do not pause for those debates. They move according to procedure, and people with law enforcement backgrounds are often bound to that process in ways others are not. Seen from that angle, the issue becomes less about whether Gucci Mane was or was not obligated to do anything by the standards people argue about online.
The more important question is what happens when somebody in his immediate circle answers to an entirely different authority. Once that person is in the picture, silence is no longer just a personal choice or a cultural statement. It becomes part of a legal environment that can expand very quickly. Waka made sure to be careful with his wording.
He did not present himself as directly labeling Gucci a snitch. Instead, he pointed to a larger reality that many people overlook. If law enforcement is around you as part of your everyday team, then the old idea that everything stays inside the room starts to break down. At that point, the situation is no longer governed only by the codes people like to talk about. It is shaped by formal duty, legal exposure, and a system that was likely going to build a case anyway. Only now, it may be able to do it faster and with far more access than before. Once you start believing street loyalty can somehow shield you from the federal government, the situation stops being simple and turns into something far more serious. Rick Ross looked at the whole mess from a business angle first. While plenty of people rushed to take loud, emotional sides, his response stayed calm, controlled, and unusually disciplined. Rather than feeding the chaos, he focused on something much less flashy and much more important: how these disputes are supposed to be handled. At the center of Ross's point was a basic idea about preparation and procedure. When an artist wants to break away from a recording agreement, there are already established ways to make that happen. The music industry has attorneys for this. It has renegotiations for this. It has structured exit plans, buyout terms, and standard contract mechanisms designed specifically for moments when a label and an artist can no longer move forward together. Those systems were not created by accident. They exist because contract disputes are common, and because the business itself is layered, expensive, and full of moving parts. With so much money, control, and long-term value tied up in these deals, formal ways of resolving conflict became necessary a long time ago. In other words, there is already a roadmap for getting out when a relationship breaks down.
What Ross made clear is that using those professional channels may be frustrating, slow, or expensive, but they are still negotiations. They are still part of the business. Crossing into intimidation is something entirely different. Showing up at a studio with weapons and demanding signatures is not a hard-nosed tactic. It is not leverage. It is not a bold negotiation strategy. It is a criminal act. That distinction matters because once that line is crossed, the consequences stretch far beyond one bad decision in one heated moment. The fallout does not stop with legal trouble. Choosing that route can destroy the very foundation someone spent years trying to build. Careers do not just suffer damage in situations like that. Entire reputations can collapse. Business relationships disappear. Trust evaporates. Opportunities vanish. Everything that took years of struggle, sacrifice, and momentum to create can unravel almost instantly. That is what made Ross's comment stand out. He was not talking like someone caught up in the drama of the moment. He sounded like someone reminding people that the industry, for all its egos and emotion, still runs on contracts, structure, and consequences.
I can't believe it! Can you believe this? I mean, what the people? What the this Gildan gang? From now on, Gucci Mane, it's Gildan Mane. I don't know about no Gucci Mane. He clearly ain't rocking Gucci. He clearly ain't selling Gucci. I was so excited for my 1017 jersey to turn up. You know what I did? I went out and bought a basketball. I was gonna dunk on these hoes.
His view was not glamorous, but it was practical. It cut through the noise and brought the conversation back to reality. Boozy Badass, on the other hand, delivered one of the rawest reactions from the entire flood of responses. His response felt different because it did not come across like a polished statement or a carefully calculated media appearance. It landed with the kind of honesty people tend to show only in real time, before publicists, headlines, and outside voices have a chance to shape the message. That is part of why his moment stood out so strongly. In the middle of a situation where many reactions sounded strategic, his felt immediate and personal. There was no obvious filter on it, no layered talking points, no effort to package it into something neat and controlled. It felt like people were watching a genuine emotional response unfold as it happened. Taken together, those reactions revealed two very different ways people process the same crisis. One side tried to frame the issue through business logic, systems, and consequences.
The other reflected the shock and emotion that naturally rise when a story this extreme breaks into public view. Both reactions drew attention, but for very different reasons. Still, Ross's central message remained the clearest. In the music world, contracts can be challenged, reworked, and even escaped through legal channels. That path may not be dramatic, but it exists for a reason. The moment someone abandons process in favor of force, the story is no longer about industry conflict. It becomes a case about crime, collapse, and the cost of making one irreversible choice. You could see him trying to absorb it as the details came in. Nothing about his reaction looked performative. It felt like a person realizing, piece by piece, just how serious the situation really was. This is someone with first-hand experience around the federal system, so he understands exactly what those charges carry. The silence, the pauses, the repeated words, it all landed like someone confronting a kind of loss they were not fully prepared to process.
He said the same 2 words 3 times, and each time they hit harder, not because they were loud, but because the meaning behind them kept sinking in. What made the moment so striking was the difference between internet chatter and what was actually unfolding. This was not a rumor spreading online. It was not blog speculation. It was not another dramatic post built for attention. A United States attorney for the Northern District of Texas was standing at a press conference and laying it out in plain terms. That changes everything. Now the story is no longer floating around in the space of maybe. It becomes official. It becomes documented. It becomes something no one can easily dismiss. Federal kidnapping, 9 arrests, 3 different cities. Those facts alone gave the situation a level of gravity that cut through all the usual noise. Anyone familiar with what real federal pressure looks like could feel immediately that this had moved into an entirely different category. People inside the culture, especially those who have seen how these cases develop, recognize the weight right away. There is a difference between controversy and consequence. There is a difference between a messy headline and a life-altering case. The people who understood that difference did not need anyone to explain why the room felt heavier after those words were spoken. Honeycomb Brazy's reaction pointed many viewers toward what some saw as the deepest heartbreak in the whole situation. For them, the most painful part was not the argument over legal consequences. It was not the non-stop debate about loyalty, rules, or public image. The real sadness was the wasted promise sitting underneath all of it. That is where the conversation gets uncomfortable. Before everything turned into headlines and court language, Pooh Shiesty had momentum that many artists spend years trying to reach. This was not a case of someone fading out and being forgotten. He was not struggling to connect. He had already broken through. The numbers were there. The attention was there. The audience was there. His name had weight, and his rise felt undeniable. Chart success changed his position. The lifestyle reflected it. The cars, the tours, the visibility, it all pointed to someone who had reached a level most never touch. Beyond that, there was something even more powerful working in his favor, the comeback angle. That kind of story always pulls people in. Audiences love redemption. They love seeing someone push through setbacks and come back bigger than before. It creates a narrative that fans, media, and the wider culture all rally around. That is why this hits so differently. When someone with that kind of trajectory gets pulled into a case this serious, the reaction goes beyond shock. It becomes a reminder of how quickly success can turn. One moment, the story is about growth, momentum, and what comes next. The next, it is about charges, arrests, and consequences that carry far more weight than social media can capture. At that point, the loss people are reacting to is not just legal risk, it is the collapse of what seemed possible. The part that stings is knowing how much was already in place. The foundation had been built, the platform was there, the spotlight was on. From the outside, it looked like the future had already opened up for him. Which is exactly why so many people saw this not just as a scandal, but as a tragedy of lost potential.
People were ready to applaud the comeback. On the surface, it looked like the complete redemption story. A man served his time, returned home, and proved he still had the same presence, the same talent, and the same pull he carried before everything fell apart. What made it even more striking was how much of it had been rebuilt from nothing. Step by step, piece by piece, the image, the momentum, the career, all of it seemed restored. Yet the way many people tell it, that rise did not last. In their view, one thing changed the trajectory entirely: pride. According to those who have weighed in from different angles, that was the turning point, the moment the comeback story started to unravel. As of April 11, 2026, Pooh Shiesty was still being held in federal custody and bond had been denied. That alone is a major development. Still, what makes the situation even more surprising is the legal and business twist surrounding it. Despite everything that has been alleged, he remained officially signed to Gucci Mane's 1017 Records. That detail stands out because of what the accusations suggest. The agreement he allegedly tried to get out of through an armed robbery was never canceled. The paperwork he allegedly tried to force into existence did not erase the original arrangement. Legally, the contract was still there. The label deal was still active. So the result is as stark as it is unusual. A reported attempt to break away from a record contract did not end with freedom from that contract. Instead, the artist was still tied to the same deal while also facing federal kidnapping charges. It sounds almost too unbelievable to be real, like the kind of twist a screenwriter would add to make a story feel more dramatic. Except, this was not fiction. This was the situation as it stood.
There is a cold irony in that outcome. The very move that was allegedly meant to end one chapter appears, at least from the outside, to have locked everything in place even tighter. Nothing was undone. Nothing was erased. If anything, the consequences only became more serious, while the original business arrangement remained untouched. Just to be clear, that is not framing it as an opinion or trying to push a message onto the story. It is simply the reality of where things landed based on the publicly described outcome. On the other side of the controversy, Gucci Mane has said nothing in response to 6ix9ine's rant. By April 11, 2026, there had been no public reply from him addressing the accusations tied to street code. He had not commented on the viral video clips that spread across social media. No interview, no direct statement, no clarification. Nothing of that kind had been released publicly. That silence has become part of the story too. While online voices kept debating the fallout, revisiting the allegations, and arguing over what it all meant, Gucci Mane stayed completely off the record. In a moment when many expected some kind of reaction, there was none. For now, that leaves the situation frozen in a strange place. Pooh Shiesty remained in custody. The 107 Records deal remained intact. The accusations remained public, and Gucci Mane remained silent. Sometimes the most shocking part of a story is not what gets said, but what never gets answered at all. As reactions poured in from every corner of the music world, he chose not to say a word. Maybe that quiet was calculated. Maybe it was composure. Maybe it was something far more personal. Whatever the reason, only he can answer that. Still, when no explanation comes, the online world rarely stays quiet for long. People step in, assumptions grow, and opinions rush to fill the gap. That silence leads the spotlight back to the figure who first sparked this entire debate. It was not Gucci. It was not Pooh Shiesty. It was not the Dallas studio. The conversation circles back to one man. Rainbow hair, tattooed face, and a reputation for standing far outside hip-hop's protected center for the last 5 years. From that position, he has kept making the same argument, again and again, no matter how unpopular it sounded. His message has been direct. According to him, what people call the code is not always the moral foundation it is presented as. In his view, it often functions more like a show, a role people play, an image they protect until real pressure enters the room. He has been pointing at the structure around him and warning that the rules people celebrate in public may not survive private reality. The point he keeps pushing is simple but uncomfortable. It is easy to speak with certainty when the stakes are distant. It is easy to praise loyalty and silence when consequences belong to someone else. Yet everything changes when the situation becomes personal, when a name appears on official paperwork, when the full power of the government is no longer an abstract idea, but a real presence sitting across the table. That, he argues, is the moment when the truth finally shows itself. Not the version repeated in songs, interviews, and online debates, but the version revealed under pressure. In that environment, people discover what the code actually means in practice. And according to his perspective, that answer is often much smaller than expected.
For years, he has stayed on the edge of the culture, almost like a permanent outsider looking in. Challenging ideas many others treat as untouchable. Because of who he is and how he presents himself, plenty of people dismissed him before even considering the argument. Yet the longer these situations keep unfolding, the harder it becomes for some observers to ignore the pattern he says has been there all along. What makes his stance so provocative is that he has never framed the idea by saying the code itself is automatically bad. That has not been his claim. He is not arguing that loyalty, principle, or discipline are meaningless as concepts. Instead, his criticism cuts in a different direction. He is questioning whether the version people defend so loudly is truly a principle at all, or whether it becomes selective depending on who is involved and what they stand to lose. That distinction matters. A real principle holds when it costs something. A performance lasts only as long as it is convenient. And the heart of his argument is that many people do not discover the difference until the pressure becomes impossible to ignore. Publicly, the language stays strong. Privately, the calculations can look very different. So while the internet continues delivering its verdicts and every major name gets pulled into the discussion, the center of this entire controversy remains the same challenge he has been issuing for years. He has been saying that the code people talk about and the code people actually live by are often not the same thing. In his eyes, the problem is not the idea itself. The problem is what it turns into when tested. His position throughout this entire debate has never been that the code is wrong as a concept. His position is that the code is...
The rules people talk about in hip-hop don't seem to land evenly. They appear to shift depending on who the artist is, how famous they are, and which side of the culture is willing to defend them. That criticism has been floating around for a long time, but April 2026 pushed it into a much sharper light. Suddenly, the conversation wasn't just based on opinion or online debate. It had something more solid behind it, something documented and impossible to ignore. No matter where you stand on him, whether you support him or can't stand him, one thing is clear. Much of the rap internet has taken a very firm position. For a huge part of that audience, the answer was decided long ago. Still, what happened in April added a new layer to the argument, one rooted in real events rather than just reputation, loyalty, or rumor. At this point, the story is still moving. The case involving Pooh Shiesty, Big 30, and the co-defendants has not reached its end, and every passing hour seems to bring another reaction, another breakdown, another post trying to make sense of it. Social platforms are overflowing with instant takes. Clips keep circulating, memes keep multiplying. People are pulling up Exhibit A like it's the final word, while others answer with Bible verses, old interviews, or even Beethoven beats playing under dramatic commentary. The entire culture is reacting in real time, and the result is chaos, fascination, and a lot of contradiction. Beneath all that noise, though, there's a bigger issue rising to the surface. It's not really about one viral post or one side winning the argument for the day. What's being challenged here is something much deeper, something hip-hop has talked about for years as if everyone understood it. Yet when the pressure hits, that understanding starts to fall apart.
The question now is uncomfortable because it doesn't come with an easy response. What is this so-called code supposed to be? When people invoke it, what are they actually defending? Who benefits from it when the stakes are real? More importantly, who gets left exposed when the rules suddenly change? That's the tension hanging over all of this. Maybe the code is real. Maybe it has always existed in some form. Or maybe what people call the code is less of a fixed principle and more of a cultural myth, a story repeated often enough that it starts to sound unquestionable. April 2026 didn't settle that debate. If anything, it made the uncertainty louder than ever.